Veiled 9 temperate forest was the kind of environment that botanical surveyors described in their field reports as productive. The professional vocabulary's compressed expression for an ecosystem whose biodiversity was dense enough to generate significant cataloging data, and whose generation was producing the specific, sustained engagement that productive ecosystems provided for the people whose professional purpose was their documentation. The forest was old growth, the canopy established across centuries of uninterrupted development, the trees reaching heights that the planet's generous atmospheric conditions and rich soil chemistry supported, the understory carrying the layered complexity that old-growth forests produced when the forests were left undisturbed long enough for the complexity to accumulate. The light beneath the canopy was filtered, the specific green-gold quality that forest interiors produced when the canopy's density was sufficient to transform direct stellar light into the ambient, diffused illumination that the filtering created. The light was beautiful. The light was also the professional environment that Silas Vey had been working in for 3 days, and whose beauty had transitioned from aesthetic experience to background condition through the specific mechanism of sustained exposure converting novelty into normality. Silas was conducting his afternoon transect, the systematic walk through a designated survey corridor that his cataloging methodology required, the walk producing the specimen collections and observational records that 3 weeks of survey work would compile into the ecological documentation report that his contract specified as the mission's deliverable. He was carrying his field kit, the portable collection of survey instruments, specimen containers, medical supplies, and emergency provisions that independent botanical surveyors maintained for the extended field work that survey missions involved. The kit was worn across his back and hip, the arrangement of a person whose professional life was conducted while walking through unfamiliar terrain, and whose walking required the equipment to be distributed for mobility rather than convenience. He was 31. He occupied the forest with the specific quality of a person whose professional comfort with natural environments was evident in the way he moved through the terrain, not the careful, deliberate navigation of a person treating the environment as obstacle, but the easy, adaptive movement of someone who treated the environment as workplace. The steps adjusting to the terrain's variation, with the automatic accommodation that experience provided when the experience was extensive enough to make the accommodation unconscious. He was 5'11", lean, carrying the frame that extended fieldwork produced, the wiry, functional physique of a man whose professional life involved sustained walking, carrying, and the general physical engagement that survey work in wilderness environments required. His face was honest, open features, warm brown eyes, the particular quality of a face whose default expression communicated approachability, because the person behind the face was approachable, and the face's communication was accurate rather than performed. His hair was brown, disordered by 3 days of field work and the forest's environmental contributions, maintained at a length that suggested grooming was a consideration in his life without being a priority. He was wearing the field clothing that survey work prescribed, practical, durable, carrying the specific evidence of 3 days of forest-based work in the form of dirt, vegetation stains, and the general patina that intensive field work deposited on the clothing that field work was conducted in. He was recording observations into his data tablet, the running field notes that his methodology required, the notes documenting specimen locations, ecological conditions, and the observations that systematic survey produced, when he heard the sound. The sound was crying. The identification was immediate. Human neurology possessed the specific, tuned sensitivity to the sound of a child in distress that evolutionary selection had produced across millions of years of social development. The sensitivity operating at a detection threshold that was lower than the threshold for other sounds, because the detection's urgency was higher. A child was crying. The crying was coming from approximately 40 meters northeast of his current position. The crying was sustained, not the brief, sharp crying of a child who had experienced a sudden shock, but the continuous, exhausted, depleted crying of a child whose distress had been ongoing, and whose ongoing had exhausted the crying's initial intensity, leaving the residual, worn-down sound that prolonged distress produced. His transect stopped, his professional function suspended, the human response activated. He found her in a clearing, a natural gap in the forest canopy where a fallen tree had created the opening that clearings required, the gap admitting direct light that the clearing's vegetation was using for the accelerated growth that direct light in forest environments produced. The clearing was small, approximately 10 meters across, carpeted with the low ground cover plants that the direct light supported. She was standing in the clearing's center. Standing was the technical description. The actual quality of her posture was closer to suspension. The specific, depleted immobility of a small body that had been moving, and was no longer moving because the moving had encountered the limit of what the body's resources could sustain, and the limit had been reached, and the reaching had produced the stillness that resource depletion generated. She was Calithy. Small, very small, the specific proportions of a child at approximately 5 years of developmental equivalence, the body carrying the combination of delicacy and resilience that children's bodies produced at the age when growth was active, and the growth's activity made the body simultaneously fragile and robust. Her skin was pale twilight violet, the lighter Calithy pigmentation that some genetic lines produced, the pigmentation carrying the soft luminosity that Calithy's skin displayed, and that the clearing's direct light was rendering visible with a clarity that the forest interior's filtered light would not have provided. Her hair was dark copper, the standard Calithy coloring, disheveled, carrying the evidence of movement through vegetation in the form of small leaves and fragments that the movement had deposited and that the dishevelment had retained. Her face was the face of a child, carrying the soft, unfinished geometry that childhood produced in Calithy features, the angular precision of the adult facial architecture present in nascent form, visible in the cheekbones and the jawline as the promise of the definition that maturity would provide, but that childhood had not yet delivered. Her eyes were large violet, the standard Calithy coloring, proportionally larger in a child's face than in an adult's, and producing the visual emphasis that large eyes in small faces created. The eyes were wet. The eyes were red-rimmed. The eyes had been producing tears, the Calithy equivalent of tears, the ocular discharge that Calithy physiology produced in response to sustained emotional distress, for long enough that the producing had left the visible evidence of duration in the irritation that the eye's tissues displayed. Her arms and legs bore scratches, minor lacerations, the kind that vegetation produced on unprotected skin when the skin was moved through dense undergrowth by a body that was not equipped to navigate the undergrowth without contact. The scratches were numerous. The scratches were not serious. The scratches were the evidence of sustained movement through the forest's interior by a child whose movement was not the careful navigation of someone choosing a path, but the desperate, undirected movement of someone who was lost, and whose lostness had produced movement without direction, and whose directionless movement had produced the scratches that the vegetation's natural abrasiveness generated. Her clothing was formal, the specific, high-quality garments that Silas's cultural familiarity with Calithy dress identified as significantly above standard, the fabric and the construction communicating the specific social stratum that the garment's quality indicated. He registered the quality without interpreting it further, the registration noting expensive clothing, without pursuing the note's implications, because the implications were secondary to the immediate, overwhelming primary datum. A child alone, crying, lost, in a forest on a planet that his survey data classified as uninhabited. She saw him. The seeing produced the specific response that lost children produced when they encountered an adult. The dual, simultaneous response of hope and fear. The hope that the adult represented rescue, and the fear that the adult represented additional danger, the two responses coexisting in the child's face with the visible, heartbreaking quality that the coexistence produced in a face too young to manage the coexistence and too frightened to resolve it. Silas stopped. He stopped because the approach's pace mattered, the approach to a frightened child, requiring the specific, calibrated movement that fear management demanded. The approach slow enough that the approaching did not trigger the flight response that fast approaches triggered, and gentle enough that the gentleness was visible, and the visible communicated safety through the mechanism of visual assessment that frightened children performed on the things that approached them. "Hey," he said, and his voice was the voice that the situation required, low, warm, gentle, carrying the specific tonal quality that adult humans produced when they were speaking to frightened children, and when the speaking was designed to communicate safety through the medium of sound. "Hey, it's okay, you're okay." She did not run. The not running was the first step, the child's assessment of the approaching adult producing the result that the approach's calibration was designed to produce. The assessment concluding that the adult was not a threat, and the conclusion's acceptance allowing the adult's continued approach. She stood in the clearing and watched him approach with the large, wet, violet eyes of a 5-year-old who had been alone and frightened for long enough that the aloneness and the fright had become her entire world, and whose entire world was now being entered by someone whose entrance was changing the world's composition from alone to not alone. He knelt. The kneeling was the specific, practical adjustment that adult humans made when they were interacting with small children. The vertical differential reduced, the eyes brought to the child's level, the body's posture communicating the thing that the kneeling was designed to communicate. "I am making myself your size because your size is where the conversation needs to happen. Are you lost?" he asked. The question was simple, the vocabulary and the complexity calibrated for the audience, the communication adjusted for a child whose processing capacity was reduced by the fear that the processing was operating under. She nodded. The nodding was small, the movement of a child whose energy for movement had been depleted, and whose depletion was expressing itself in the minimized amplitude of the gestures the body produced. The nod was accompanied by a fresh wave of the crying that the encounter had briefly interrupted. The tears returning as the encounter's safety released the suppression that the fear had been maintaining, the safety allowing the distress to express itself, because the expression was now safe, and the safe made the expression possible. "I'm Silas," he said. "I'm going to help you. Can you tell me your name?" "Nayli," she said, and the name was produced through the crying with the specific, compressed quality that names carried when they were spoken by children, whose vocal capacity was being shared with the crying, and whose sharing reduced the name to its essential phonemes. The name was delivered without a dynastic suffix, without the sorkin that would have identified her as imperial lineage, the absence being the specific omission that a 5-year-old produced when the 5-year-old's understanding of names was limited to the personal identifier, rather than the complete formal designation that Kalithi adult nomenclature included. "Nayli, that's a good name. Nayli, I'm going to stay with you until we figure out where your family is. Is that okay?" She nodded again. The nod was larger, the amplitude increasing as the safety's presence accumulated, and the accumulation produced the energy that the depletion had been suppressing. The nod was followed by the specific physical action that the nod's agreement preceded. She moved toward him. The movement was the movement of a child who had found safety, and whose finding was being expressed through the physical mechanism that finding safety activated in children. The approach, the proximity seeking, the specific behavior of a small body moving toward a large body, because the large body represented protection, and the representing was being accepted. She reached him. She did not hug him. The contact was not the embrace that older children or adults would have produced. The contact was the specific 5-year-old version. She stood next to him, close enough that her body was touching his leg, and she gripped the fabric of his field jacket with one hand. The grip was small. The grip was firm. The grip was the specific, primal, developmental expression of a child who had found a person to hold onto, and whose holding was being performed with the intensity that the lostness and the fright and the relief of the finding combined to produce. She held his jacket. He stayed kneeling. The forest's afternoon light filtered through the clearing's canopy gap and illuminated them both. The man and the child, the surveyor and the lost girl, the human whose afternoon of botanical cataloging had just been converted into something that botanical cataloging's professional framework did not contain a protocol for, and that the framework's absence meant he was operating on the only protocol available, the human one. "Okay, Naley," he said, and his voice maintained the warm, gentle quality that the situation required, and that the quality's maintenance was the thing he could do, and that the doing was what the child needed, and that the needing was the instruction that the doing followed. "We're going to go back to my camp. I've got food and a place to rest. We'll figure the rest out from there." She held his jacket. She did not let go. She was not going to let go. The not letting go was the communication, the 5-year-old's expression of the assessment's conclusion. This person was safety, and safety was not being released. He stood. He adjusted the specific physical adjustment that adults made when a child was attached to their leg, and when the attachment was being maintained during movement, the adult learning to walk with the modified gait that the attachment required. The modification was immediate. The modification was, like all things involving children and the adults who helped them, performed without thought because the performing was the instinct, and the instinct did not require thought. They walked back to camp. The walking was slow, calibrated for 5-year-old legs and 5-year-old endurance, the pace the child's pace, the adult's stride reduced to the child's stride's requirements. The walking was quiet, the child's crying subsiding as the walking and the hand on the jacket, and the adult's presence combined to produce the progressive calming that safety produced in children who had been unsafe, and whose unsafety was being replaced. The camp was the modest installation that independent survey work produced. Silas's shuttle parked in a clearing he had identified on orbital approach, surrounded by the field equipment that 3 days of survey work had accumulated. Specimen containers, data recording equipment, the weather protection materials that his field kit included for overnight shelter supplementation, and the portable provisions that 3 weeks of independent field work required. The camp was not impressive. The camp was functional, carrying the specific quality of a workspace arranged by a person whose arrangement priorities were efficiency and practicality rather than comfort and aesthetics. He fed her. The feeding was performed with the field rations that his emergency provisions contained. The cross-species compatible nutrition, supplies that the framework's standard survey kits included for the specific contingency of encountering members of allied species during fieldwork, and that the contingency's provision made available for the current situation's unexpected application. The rations were not gourmet. The rations were adequate, providing the caloric and nutritional content that a 5-year-old Calithi body required, delivered in the portable, shelf-stable format that emergency rations used, and that the format's practicality made forgettable as food and essential as sustenance. She ate. The eating was the specific, focused consumption that hungry children produced. The food engaged with the singular attention that hunger provided, and that the attention's singularity communicated how long the child had been without food, and how long had been long enough to produce the hunger that the eating's intensity expressed. He cleaned her scratches. The cleaning was performed with the medical supplies his field kit provided: antiseptic, adhesive bandages, the basic wound care materials that field kits contained for the minor injuries that fieldwork generated. The cleaning required her to release his jacket, the hand transferring from the jacket's fabric to his arm as he worked. The contact maintained through the transfer, because the contact's maintenance was the non-negotiable condition that the child's attachment imposed, and that the imposing was absolute, and the absolute was not going to be negotiated. He fashioned a shelter. The fashioning was crude. The weather protection materials from his field kit arranged over a frame of collected branches, producing a structure that was less shelter and more material arranged to provide overhead coverage and windbreak. The structure's quality reflecting its constructor's expertise, which was botanical survey rather than construction, and which the reflecting made evident in the structure's architectural qualities, which were minimal. He talked to her. The talking was the sustained, gentle, patient communication that frightened children required, not the information-dense conversation that adults conducted, but the comfort-providing verbal presence that children needed when the needing was the need for a voice that was calm and warm and present, and whose presence communicated through the medium of continuous sound, the thing that the presence was designed to communicate. You are not alone, the not alone is stable, the stable is going to continue. She talked back. The talking back was gradual, the initial silence giving way to single-word responses, the single-word responses giving way to short sentences, the short sentences expanding as the safety accumulated, and the accumulation produced the verbal confidence that safety provided to children, whose verbal confidence had been suppressed by the fear that the safety was replacing. She told him she was on the planet with her mother. She told him she had been exploring, the exploring being the specific, 5-year-old version of exploring, which was walking through the forest near the place they were staying because the forest was interesting, and the interesting was the motivation that 5-year-olds used for the exploring that 5-year-olds did. She told him she had gotten lost, the getting lost being the specific, common, developmentally normal experience of a child, whose exploration exceeded the child's navigational capacity, and whose exceeding produced the lostness that the exceeding's natural consequence provided. She did not tell him who her mother was. The not telling was not concealment. It was the specific, 5-year-old limitation of a child whose understanding of identity did not include the institutional dimensions that adult identity contained. The child knowing her mother as mother, rather than as the sovereign of an interstellar empire whose image is broadcast across every communication channel in the sector. The hours passed. The afternoon gave way to evening. The evening's light changed, the stellar illumination shifting toward the amber gold that planetary evenings produced. The light's change marking the time's passage, and the passage marking the duration that the child had been in his care, and the duration's length making the question of where the child's guardians were increasingly urgent, and the urgency increasingly producing the concern that urgency produced when the concern was about a child's welfare, and the welfare's uncertainty was growing with the hours. He tried his communication equipment. The equipment's signals were not reaching, the planet's atmospheric conditions producing interference that his survey-grade communications could not penetrate. The interference explaining why his orbital survey had not detected the planet's actual occupation, and the explaining being the specific technical reality of a communication system that was designed for botanical survey, rather than for the detection of classified imperial installations that the planet's atmosphere was designed to conceal. He did what he could do. He maintained the camp. He maintained the shelter. He maintained the contact, the hand on his jacket, the physical presence that the contact provided, the sustained, warm, patient proximity of an adult who was doing the thing the child needed by being the thing the child needed. Present, calm, available. Naley fell asleep against his side. The falling asleep was the specific, gradual process that children produced when the safety had accumulated to the threshold that sleep required, and the threshold's crossing was permitted by the safety's presence, and the presence's continuation into the sleeping was the condition that the sleeping demanded. She fell asleep with her hand on his jacket. The grip loosened in sleep, but did not release, the hand maintaining the contact with the reduced but persistent tension that sleeping children maintained when the contact was the thing the sleeping was occurring in the context of, and the context stability was the sleeping's condition. He sat in the crude shelter with a sleeping alien child against his side, and the forest's evening sounds around them and the specific, quiet, immense quality of being responsible for a small person whose trust you had earned, and whose trust's earning made you responsible, and whose responsibility was the thing you were going to maintain, because the maintaining was the thing that was right, and the right was the instruction, and the instruction was clear. The sky changed first. The change was not the gradual transition that natural atmospheric phenomena produced. It was the sudden, comprehensive disruption that artificial, atmospheric displacement generated. The air above the forest canopy displaced by objects descending through it with the speed and mass that produced the displacement's violence. The violence registering as pressure change and sound, and the darkening of the sky by the shapes of vessels whose number and type communicated through their presence the specific, unambiguous message that whatever was arriving with the force that the arriving's purpose required. Silas's training, not military training, but the survival awareness that independent fieldwork in unfamiliar environments developed, registered the arrival's implications before the arrival's details resolved. He was on his feet. The standing was performed with the careful motion that the sleeping child's position required, Nellie waking at the movement, her grip on his jacket tightening with the specific, reflexive response that sleeping children produced when the sleeping was interrupted, and the interruption was accompanied by the movement that the interruption's cause was producing in the body the sleeping was occurring against. She was awake. She was gripping his jacket. She was positioning herself behind his leg, the instinctive shelter-seeking posture that children adopted when the children perceived threat, and when the threat's perception was being managed through the mechanism of placing themselves behind the adult whose presence constituted safety. The figures materialized around the camp. The materialization was fast transport technology depositing personnel in the camp's perimeter with the tactical precision that professional military deployment produced. The deposited personnel assuming positions that the position's spacing and orientation identified as perimeter containment. The containment designed to prevent the contained person's departure in any direction. They were armed. The armament was the advanced weaponry that professional military forces carried, the weapon's type and configuration communicating the specific, lethal quality that professional military armament communicated. These were not security personnel. These were soldiers. The soldiers' deployment communicated threat assessment at the highest level, the assessment that whoever was in the camp represented a danger sufficient to warrant the response that the danger's assessment required. The weapons were pointed at him. The pointing was the specific, professional, non-negotiable communication that weapons orientation provided when the orientation was deliberate. You are the assessed threat. Silas stood very still. The standing still was the specific response that weapon facing produced in people whose survival instincts were functioning, and whose functioning produced the stillness that survival's arithmetic calculated as the optimal response to the input of weapons pointed at you. The stillness that communicated non-threat, that provided no movement-based trigger for the weapon's deployment, that maintained the survival margin that stillness provided when the alternative to stillness was movement, and the movement's consequences were lethal. The child was behind his leg. The child's hand was on his jacket. The child was using him as shelter. The using was visible to the soldiers whose perimeter positions provided sightlines to the camp's center, visible in the specific configuration of a small body positioned behind a larger body in the instinctive arrangement that children used for the adults they trusted. The lead figure stepped forward. The figure was armored, the personal combat armor that senior military personnel wore, the armor's quality and markings identifying the wearer's rank as the highest present, the identification communicating that whoever was beneath the armor was the authority directing the operation. The figure reached up. The figure removed the helmet. The face beneath the helmet was the face that galactic news feeds had made the most recognized face in the sector. Silas recognized the face. The recognition was not immediate. The recognition required the transition from context to identification. The face's familiarity registering before the familiarity source was retrieved. The retrieval taking the specific, processing-intensive moment that retrieval required when the familiar thing was being encountered in a context that the familiarity's original context did not contain. He had seen this face on diplomatic broadcasts. He had seen this face on trade authority communications. He had seen this face in the background imagery of every spaceport he had transited through in 7 years of botanical survey work in this sector. The Veiled Empress, sovereign of the Obsidian Protectorate, ruler of the Calithi sovereignty, the mother, Nayli's mother. Empress Veilith Sorkeen stood in the camp's clearing with her helmet in her hand, and the forest's evening light on her face, and the specific, total, devastating intensity of a mother who had been searching for her child, and who had found her child, and whose finding was being processed simultaneously with the assessment of the person the child had been found with. Her features were the features that the broadcasts displayed, the angular Calithi precision at its most refined, the deep twilight blue pigmentation, the violet eyes that were larger and more vivid than any broadcast had captured, because broadcasts could not capture the specific quality that those eyes possessed when the eyes were directed at a person with the full force of the intelligence, and the authority and the maternal assessment that the directing carried. Her bioluminescent patterns were in a state that the camp's lighting made visible. The complex, shifting configuration that communicated the specific, simultaneous presence of multiple emotional states. The white gold of relief, the sharp silver of sustained alert, and the analytical blue of assessment. The three present simultaneously because the situation required all three, and the requiring was the mother and the sovereign and the security commander operating in parallel. She looked at Silas. The looking was the assessment, the specific, comprehensive, analytical evaluation that the looking constituted, every dimension of the person being evaluated, measured, and cataloged with the speed that the evaluator's intelligence and training provided. She looked at the child. The child was behind Silas's leg. The child's hand was on his jacket. The child's position was the position that children adopted with trusted adults. Nayli, she said, and the name carried everything, the relief, the fear's aftermath. The mother's voice reaching the child through the institutional armor and the sovereign's authority and the military deployment, and all of it falling away in the 2 syllables of the child's name, because the 2 syllables were the mother's voice, and the mother's voice was the thing that made everything else secondary. Nayli's response was immediate. The 5-year-old's face transformed, the fear and the uncertainty and the sustained distress of the hours dissolving in the recognition that the voice produced, the recognition that was not intellectual but constitutional, the recognition of the voice that meant safety at the deepest level that safety existed for a child. "Mama," she said, but she did not let go of Silas's jacket. The not letting go was the specific, developmental response of a child whose attachment to the safety she had found was not overridden by the arrival of the safety she had lost. The 2 safeties coexisting in the child's emotional architecture. The found safety and the returned safety both present, both valued. The child unwilling to release one to access the other, because the releasing felt like the loss that the child had already experienced, and the experience had taught her that releasing safety was how you became lost. "This man helped me," Nayli said, and the sentence was the 5-year-old's complete report, the comprehensive summary of the hours between the losing and the finding, reduced to the essential by the 5-year-old's processing capacity, and the essential being the thing that mattered. "This man helped me." Veilith looked at the surveyor. The looking was the continuation of the assessment that the looking's first phase had initiated. the evaluation deepening now that the child's statement had provided the context that the evaluation required, the context being the child's trust and the trust's expression, and the expression's implications for the person the trust was directed at. The monitoring system's data was available to her. The surveillance that the planet's security infrastructure maintained had recorded the hours that the surveyor had spent with the child, the recording providing the behavioral evidence that the assessment required. The evidence showed a man who found a lost child and who comforted the child and who fed the child and who cleaned the child's injuries and who built a shelter and who talked to the child with the patient, gentle, sustained warmth that genuine care produced. The evidence showed no recognition of the child's identity, no deferential behavior, no calculating adjustment, no performance of the specific, strategic behaviors that a person who knew they had found the crown heir would have produced. The evidence showed a man who treated a scared kid as a scared kid. The evidence was consistent with authentic ignorance, the complete, genuine, unperformed ignorance of a person who had no idea who the child was and whose no idea freed his behavior from every calculation that the idea would have imposed. The security commander's assessment was that the human represented no threat. The assessment was based on the behavioral data. The assessment was sufficient for the security function. The mother's assessment was different. The mother's assessment operated on different criteria than the security assessment. The mother assessing not threat but character, not danger but trustworthiness. The evaluation of whether the person her daughter had trusted was a person the trust could be safely placed with. The evaluation conducted with the specific, maternal analytical intensity that mothers applied to the assessment of people who had been close to their children. You did not know who she was, Veiled said, and the statement was the assessment's first test. The voice carrying the specific, measured quality that the sovereign used for evaluations whose outcomes mattered, and whose mattering required the precision that the evaluation's conduct demanded. I didn't know there was anyone on this planet, Silas said, and his voice carried the specific quality of a man who was being evaluated by the most powerful person in the sector, while standing in a crude shelter made of weather protection materials and survey equipment with a child attached to his leg and dirt and tree sap, covering approximately 60% of his visible surface area. My survey data classifies this world as uninhabited. I found a lost child in the forest. I helped her. That is the complete scope of my knowledge of the situation. You helped her. She was alone, she was crying. She was scratched up and frightened, and she was 5 years old and she was alone in a forest, and he looked at the soldiers. He looked at the weapons that were no longer pointed at him, but whose presence communicated the capacity that the pointing had represented. He looked at the Empress whose assessment was ongoing, and whose ongoing was being conducted with the analytical intensity that the assessment stakes produced. I did what anyone would do. Not anyone would do what the monitoring data shows you did, Veiled said, and the statement carried the weight of the data's content, the hours of recorded behavior, the sustained care, the patience, the gentle talking and the scratch cleaning, and the shelter building and the specific, quiet, immense quality of an adult sitting with a sleeping child against his side, and the forest's evening sounds around them, and the responsibility that the sitting represented, and the representing being genuine. Not anyone would spend hours comforting a child. They had no obligation to assist on a planet they had no reason to be responsible for. Not anyone would adjust their speaking pace for a child's comprehension and clean injuries with field medical supplies, and build a shelter and share emergency rations, and sit still for 2 hours because the child fell asleep against them, and the sitting still was the thing the sleeping required. The monitoring data is detailed. The monitoring data is comprehensive. The planet's security surveillance is continuous. I have observed everything you did from the moment you found her. Then you know. I know you did not know. I know your behavior is consistent with authentic ignorance. I know you treated my daughter as her voice encountered the specific word that the encounter required, and that the word's content made the encounter produce the brief, visible pause that encounters with personally significant words produced. As a child who needed help, without deference, without recognition, without the performance that recognition would have produced, you treated her as a person, and the person's treatment was genuine, and the genuine is. She paused. The pause was not the sovereign's measured consideration. It was the mother's emotional processing, encountering the limit of what processing could contain without the containing producing visible output. Her bioluminescent patterns shifted, the analytical blue giving way to the deep gold that the chromatic vocabulary classified as Veiled, the expression of something valued. The genuine is what she needed, Veiled said. And the genuine is rare in my experience of how people behave when they are near my family. Naley was still holding his jacket. The grip had not loosened during the conversation, the child maintaining the contact with the specific, 5-year-old certainty that the contact was important and that the important was not to be released regardless of the adult-level conversation occurring above her. The not releasing was communicating to the Empress the thing that the not releasing communicated to every person in the clearing. The child trusted this man, and the trust was the 5-year-old's assessment, and the assessment was honest because 5-year-olds did not perform trust, and the not performing was the assessment's evidence. You are on my private world, Veiled said. Unauthorized. Your survey authorization was granted based on false classification data. The authorization is void. Your presence is technically trespass. I understand. The trespass is, under the circumstances, something I am willing to categorize as the specific, forgivable kind of trespass that occurs when the trespasser's ignorance is genuine, and the trespasser's behavior during the trespass produced the outcome that the behavior produced. The outcome being that my daughter was safe and cared for and comforted during the hours when my security apparatus was searching for her, and my searching was producing the specific, sustained, escalating fear that searching produced when the searching's object was your child, and the searching was not finding her. She looked at Naley. The looking was the specific maternal gaze that mothers directed at their children when the children had been lost and the found made the looking carry the weight that the losing and the finding combined to produce. She knelt, the motion bringing her to the child's level the way that Silas had knelt in the clearing, the same instinctive adult adjustment that children's height required, and that parents performed with the same unconscious automaticity that Silas had performed it with. Naley, she said, and her voice was the mother's voice, warm, gentle, carrying the specific tonal quality that parents produced when they were speaking to their children, and the speaking was the reunion, and the reunion was the thing that the hours of separation had made necessary. I'm here. Naley looked at her mother. Naley looked at Silas. Naley looked at her hand on Silas's jacket. The looking was the 5-year-old's processing, the cognitive system working through the developmental task that the situation presented. The safety she had found and the safety that had returned, and the two safeties' coexistence and the coexistence's resolution. The resolution was 5-year-old logic. She released the jacket with one hand, reached for her mother with the same hand, gripped her mother's armor, and maintained the grip on Silas's jacket with the other hand. Both safeties maintained. Both contacts preserved. The 5-year-old solution to the problem of two safeties, hold both. Veiled looked at the hand on her armor. She looked at the hand on Silas's jacket. She looked at the man whose jacket was being held. The surveyor, the botanist, the human who was covered in dirt and tree sap, and who was standing in a crude shelter made of weather protection materials on a planet he was not supposed to be on, holding a connection to a child whose identity he had not known, and whose mother was the most powerful person in the sector. You have a complicated afternoon, Veiled said. The afternoon exceeded my professional scope approximately 6 hours ago. and yet you remained within what appears to be a personal scope that the professional's absence did not diminish. The personal scope involves helping lost children. The scope does not require professional credentials. She stood. The standing was the sovereign's return, the mother's moment giving way to the institutional reality that the sovereign's presence required, and that the requiring was the condition that the clearing's other occupants, the soldiers, the security apparatus, the imperial authority's operational framework, demanded because the framework's operation was the thing that the sovereign's presence maintained, and the maintaining was not optional. Your survey contract is void. Your presence on this world is unauthorized. Your departure will be arranged. She looked at him. The looking was the assessment's conclusion, the evaluation complete, the data processed, the conclusion reached. The conclusion was visible in the gold of her bioluminescent patterns, the veil heathen that the conclusion produced because the conclusion's content was the content that the gold expressed, valued. Your departure will be arranged at your convenience rather than at my security apparatus's preference, because your convenience is the accommodation that your behavior has earned, and because the behavior's earning makes the accommodation appropriate. Thank you. The gratitude is mine. The word's delivery was careful, the specific, measured production of a word that the sovereign's institutional architecture did not typically produce, and that the production required the override of the architecture's default output, which was authority rather than gratitude, command rather than thanks. My daughter was lost. You found her. You helped her. You did not know who she was, and the not knowing is why the help